As of the morning of March 16, 2026, the President of the United States had personally contacted 7 allied nations, asking each one to deploy warships to the Strait of Hormuz. Every single one refused, publicly, on the record. Trump posted on Truth Social calling on China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and others to send their navies. When that was met with silence, he told the Financial Times that a refusal would be, in his words, very bad for the future of NATO. When that too got no response, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz went on television and used language that fundamentally changed the framing. He said, "The United States welcomes, encourages, and even demands allied participation. That is not the language of a partner requesting help. That is the language of a government that has run out of options." Then White House Press Secretary Caroline Levitt told reporters that these nations should contribute because they are, and this is her exact phrasing, benefiting greatly from the United States military taking out the threat of Iran. The translation is blunt. We started this war alone. We need you to treat it as a shared victory, and we need you to send your ships into the firing line to prove it. Not one country said yes, and it did not stop at the 7 he asked. Germany, Greece, Italy, and Spain all went on record refusing, without even being named. We need to talk about why every single ally is rejecting Trump's call for help, what that tells us about where this conflict is heading, and how Iran is using control of the Strait to pull American allies away from Washington and closer to Tehran. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer held a press conference and said plainly, "We will not be drawn into the wider war," adding that this was never envisioned to be a NATO mission. Trump's reaction was personal. He mocked Starmer for saying he needed to consult his team before making a decision, stating, "You do not need to meet with your team. You are the Prime Minister." That is a sitting American president publicly ridiculing the leader of America's closest ally for following basic democratic process. Germany's Defense Minister Boris Pistorius gave a 7-word response that carries more weight than any policy paper. "This is not our war. We have not started it." Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul said Berlin expects Washington and Tel Aviv to inform Berlin, to include Berlin, and to tell Berlin when their goals have been achieved. That is not the language of an ally hedging. That is the language of a government demanding to be treated as something other than a cleanup crew. France hedged but functionally refused. President Macron referenced a possible future mission when circumstances permit. The circumstance he is waiting for is the end of hostilities, which means he has agreed to nothing during the only window that matters. Canada declined. Australia's Transport Minister Catherine King said the United States had not formally asked for support, and Canberra was not prepared to offer it. Japan said it is reviewing its options within the scope of Japanese law, but has no plans to send ships. Greece said no. Italy's foreign minister said diplomacy must prevail. Spain's defense minister, Margarita Robles, delivered what may be the sharpest rejection of all. She said, "Spain will never accept any stopgap measures because the objective must be for the war to end, and for it to end now." Then the European Union weighed in collectively. Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas gathered EU foreign ministers in Brussels to discuss Europe's response to the Iran war and the pressure from Washington to help secure the strait. Afterwards, she said there was no appetite to extend the EU's existing naval mission into Hormuz, adding simply, "Nobody wants to go actively into this war. 0 countries have committed forces. Most people think this rejection is about political disagreement. They see it as European leaders grandstanding, playing to domestic audiences, avoiding risk. In reality, the refusal is structural. It follows a logic so consistent across a dozen capitals that it reveals something broken at the foundation of the entire alliance system. Every nation that said no arrived at that answer through a different internal debate, but they all landed on the same conclusion. The first and deepest reason is the total absence of prior consultation. In the days before February 28th, Trump reportedly told Gulf Arab allies the entire operation would be finished in 4 days. Total Iranian capitulation. Kevin Hassett, his chief economic advisor, repeated a 4 to 6 week timeline on the Sunday shows and insisted the administration was ahead of schedule. That timeline has since been contradicted by Israel's own military, which announced the war will last at least 3 more weeks, with thousands of targets remaining. What became visible almost immediately was that key allies had been given no clarity about U.S. war aims, timelines, or the conditions for ending the conflict. As Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna put it simply, what will be the plan? The second reason is the relationship itself. For years, Trump targeted these same allies with tariffs, withdrawal threats, public insults, and NATO funding ultimatums. He pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. He called the alliance obsolete. He imposed trade penalties on European steel and aluminum. He ridiculed Macron, Merkel, and Trudeau on the global stage. And now, the first time he genuinely needs their military cooperation, he is not asking, he is threatening. He told the Financial Times that NATO faces a very bad future if countries do not comply. That is not coalition building. That is coercion from a position of weakness, and every government on that call list recognizes exactly what it is. The third reason is domestic politics. European voters are overwhelmingly hostile to this conflict. Energy prices were already painful from the post-Ukraine era. Brent crude has now surged past $100 a barrel. Petrol prices are climbing across every EU member state. Natural gas is spiking because Qatar's liquefied natural gas, which European nations have relied on heavily since cutting ties with Russian supply, transits the very strait that is now effectively sealed. Any European leader who sends warships into the Persian Gulf alongside the American Navy is ending their own political career. Robles in Madrid understood that. Pistorius in Berlin understood that. Starmer in London understood that. The fourth reason runs even deeper. The war is directly enriching Russia. Callas said it publicly. The Strait of Hormuz closure is funneling revenue into Moscow's war machine because every dollar oil climbs above $70 is another dollar funding Russia's campaign in Ukraine. And here's the part that infuriates Brussels more than anything else. The United States is simultaneously granting sanctions waivers, allowing India and other nations to purchase Russian crude already at sea. NATO's primary strategic concern is Russia. The war Trump is waging against Iran is financing the very adversary that NATO exists to confront. He is asking European capitals to send destroyers to the Gulf while his own Treasury Department greenlights Russian oil sales. The contradiction is not subtle, it is policy. Now consider the geography, because even if the political will existed, the military problem is severe. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, and Iran controls the mountainous northern shoreline. Tehran has spent decades preparing to threaten shipping there with mines, missiles, drones, fast attack craft, and asymmetric tactics refined over 4 decades of preparation for exactly this confrontation. The U.S. military has already confirmed it destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels near the strait, which illustrates precisely how quickly any escort mission could become a direct shooting war. There's also a recent precedent that no defense ministry has forgotten: the Red Sea. The Houthi disruption was a smaller-scale preview of this exact scenario. A non-state militia with a fraction of Iran's capabilities shut down one of the busiest shipping corridors on Earth. 2 administrations launched strikes. Biden admitted the strikes were not working and continued them anyway. Trump did the same and eventually walked away. The Red Sea was never fully secured. Every allied military strategist drew one conclusion from that episode: if the full power of the American Navy could not reopen the Red Sea against the Houthis, no patchwork coalition is going to hold the Strait of Hormuz against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And now comes the part that most coverage has missed entirely. Iran is not just blocking the strait. Iran is using the strait as a sorting mechanism. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi went on CBS and stated it plainly: the Strait of Hormuz is open. It is only closed to American, Israeli, and allied vessels. Others are free to pass. Then Tehran proved it. A Pakistani-flagged Aframax tanker transited the strait on March 16th carrying Abu Dhabi crude. 2 Indian LPG carriers passed through safely. A Turkish vessel received clearance from Iran. China is in direct negotiations with Tehran for guaranteed passage of its crude and Qatari LNG shipments. France and the United Kingdom have reportedly opened back-channel talks with Tehran about securing safe passage for their own vessels. Follow that logic to its conclusion. Every allied capital now faces a binary choice: join an American convoy mission and guarantee that Iran classifies your ships as hostile targets, or negotiate directly with Tehran, stay out of the war, and keep your oil flowing. Washington is offering its partners the privilege of becoming combatants. Tehran is offering them the privilege of becoming customers. For any government making that calculation, the answer is not difficult. This is the strategic maneuver that no one in the administration appears to have anticipated. Iran has converted the strait from a military choke point into a diplomatic lever that is actively peeling allies away from American leadership. Every nation that negotiates with Tehran for safe passage is implicitly recognizing Iranian authority over the waterway. Every successful transit arranged through Iranian channels is a quiet rejection of American power. The alliance is not just failing to assemble. It is being disassembled from the outside, by the very adversary the war was supposed to eliminate. The economic architecture underneath all of this is collapsing in parallel. Before the war, 138 ships transited the strait daily. As of this week, UK Maritime Trade Operations reports no more than 5. Oil exports through the waterway have dropped below 10% of pre-conflict levels according to the IEA. Brent crude is trading between 102 and 116 a barrel and touched $120 last week. The IEA announced on March 11th the largest emergency reserve release in its 52-year history: 400 million barrels across 32 nations. The United States alone is contributing 172 million barrels from a strategic petroleum reserve that contains only 415 million. That is 41% of America's entire emergency stockpile, and the release has not stabilized prices. Crude climbed 17% in the days following the announcement. Iraq's southern oil field production has collapsed 70%, falling from 4.3 million barrels a day to 1.3 million. Kuwait has announced precautionary output cuts. Saudi Arabia is rerouting what it can through its east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, but that pipeline was never built to replace the strait. The deficit stands at roughly 12 million barrels per day, and no combination of reserves, pipelines, and alternate routes can close it. And it is not only oil. Global LNG supply has been cut by 20% because Qatar, a major exporter, ships through the same choke point, directly undermining Europe's effort to replace Russian gas since 2022. Fertilizer, helium, and uranium shipments are also stalled. China has already tapped its strategic fertilizer reserve. The United States does not have one. Meanwhile, the broader global picture continues to fracture. North Korea fired multiple ballistic missiles into the sea 2 days ago during U.S.-South Korea military drills. China has increased military activity around Taiwan. The PLA is reportedly monitoring this conflict on live screens, tracking missile trajectories and strike patterns in real time. They are not intervening. They are studying. Dubai International Airport was struck by a drone that hit a fuel depot and forced a temporary suspension of operations. Commercial flights turned around mid-route. Qatar intercepted a second wave of Iranian missiles this morning. Kuwait's airport remains shuttered. Abu Dhabi is running at limited capacity. And a Trump administration advisor publicly warned about the risk of nuclear escalation, a remark that stood out precisely because it brought a taboo scenario into open discussion. So put the full picture together. The assumption before February 28th was 4 days. Total Iranian capitulation, the strait stays open, allies fall in line. The reality is week 3. The strait under Iranian control, oil above $100, the largest reserve release in history failing to hold prices, and a unanimous public, on-the-record rejection from every allied capital Washington contacted. The assumption was regime collapse. The reality is that the son of the killed supreme leader assumed power within 72 hours and declared the strait will remain sealed as leverage. The assumption was that a coalition forms quickly, escorts begin, and global trade resumes. The reality is that not one nation has committed a single warship, and several are now negotiating directly with Tehran for the access Washington promised its coalition would provide. Iran's gamble also deserves scrutiny. Tehran framed its closure as total. The reality is selective, with passage granted to nations willing to deal bilaterally. That is not a blockade born of strength. It is a calculated gamble that depends on the war not escalating to the point where Iran's own coastline becomes the front line. If the administration moves toward a ground seizure of Karg Island, which handles 90% of Iran's crude exports, Tehran's leverage evaporates entirely. Iran's gamble requires that escalation does not reach that threshold. Whether that bet holds is the question neither side can answer tonight. And the only question that remains is whether the next phase of this conflict is decided in Washington, in Tehran, or in the dozen allied capitals that have just told the most powerful military on earth that it is on its own.